species that live there, we can talk about something called their niche. And niche is a word that sort of means sort of the whole role that the organism plays in the ecosystem. Sort of lots of different parts of its behavior, what it does, are part of its niche. Things like when it eats, what it eats, when it is active, where it nests, when it sleeps. Just sort of all these various details about its life history all make up that species' niche. So a deer, for example, has a certain niche. A deer is a grazer. It eats plants. It lives in sort of generally a forest ecosystem. It's active during the daytime. It travels through a fairly wide range of area. So all those little bits and pieces of information together make up that deer's range. And so you may have many different species living in one habitat. The habitat, again, is the location. It's where the organism lives. And so the white-tailed deer and a great blue heron.
What's that?
So it's a bird. They share a habitat, but do they have the same niche?
No.
Who knows something about a heron?
It's got like really long legs.
It's got long, thin legs. What else, Jackson?
Like, they're blue.
Yeah, they're bluish gray. What do they eat?
They have long beaks and they put it in the swamp water to get food.
Yeah, they actually eat fish. They capture fish along the shoreline. So they live in the same habitat really as the white-tailed deer, but they don't have the same niche, obviously. They both do different things. They have different food sources and so on. So organisms often share a habitat, but usually they don't share the same niche.
What if they did?
Hold on.
Yeah, what if they did? What they're like,
Hold on. So sometimes two species may have very similar niche. For example, if we think again about that great blue heron that hunts along the shoreline, that eats fish, is active in the daytime. If there were a species of crane that also lived in that area, also ate fish in the same vicinity and so forth, what do you think the result of that would be? They would, but what? Well, close. Competition. When two species have the same niche, like in my example, they would be competing for some of the resources. They'd both be trying to get the same fish in the same area. And so usually if you have species competing, often one is better adapted and will get more of that resource. What happens to the other one?
They die.
They die off. Maybe they adjust their niche. For example, if the crane starts feeding farther into the water, where the heron doesn't usually feed, now they don't have the same niche anymore, and possibly they can both coexist in that same habitat. Now there are species of birds, for example, that eat same sort of things, the same berries from the same trees, but one species of bird eats low on a tree, and another species eats higher on the tree. So they've offset their niche, so they're actually not competing for those resources anymore. And it's not just animals that compete. Plants compete as well. Plants compete for moisture out of the soil. They compete for sunlight by trying to grow taller, grow faster. So other species can also compete.
Succession, that's a vocab word in history.
It is? Oh yeah, so who is the president that succeeded Bill Clinton?
Abraham, no, wait.
JFK.
I don't know. Abraham Lincoln.
Mr. Arcuri told me he asked this class this and was very
He called the George
disappointed about the...
Was it George Bush?
Thomas
Jefferson. No, George
W. All right. Anyway, what does succession mean?
To withdraw.
No, that's
Secession.
secession
Secession.
with an E, like the southern states seceded from the Union.
Break away.
Succession means something else.
Secede.
Okay?
It means to like be better at something.
Not so much that's succeed. This is succession. Means to come after. And so in ecology, succession is when one ecosystem gradually changes and is replaced by another over a period of time. And this is exactly what we were talking about in our question of the day. If a forest fire were to destroy a forest, well, soon afterwards, within that season, new plants would start to grow. And if you follow that ecosystem over a long period of time, you see the ecosystem would change over time, gradually, until eventually would most likely return back to the stable forest that it started off as before the forest fire.
When we learned about prescribed burn, it said that like different plant species will grow there too.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't room for them originally to grow.
Sometimes new species come in and sort of restart this progression. Some species, like I think somebody mentioned, Joe, mentioned require fire. Or I think it's bristlecone pine, the pine cones, which are reproductive structures that have seeds in them. They don't open up until a fire basically melts the resin that hold them all close together. Once a forest fire comes, that resin melts, they open up and they drop their seeds to sort of repopulate the ecosystem after a fire. It's that species adaptation to surviving in ecosystems where there's fires relatively regularly. All right, so that process of change is called succession. And it can be like a forest fire, or if you plowed a field, they are going to plant with, let's say, corn, but then the farmer decided not to. Well, it may start off as bare soil, but pretty soon, what is going to be there after a week or so? A field, girls. If you plowed a field and you just had soil and you left it, about a week later, what's it going to be? Weeds. You know, small weeds are small, fast-growing plants that can get hold quickly and start to grow. Well, then what if you plowed it a month later?
Lots of weeds.
Lots of weeds, but probably you're starting to get some taller plants. If you plowed it a couple years later, you probably start to see some woody vegetation, some sort of bushes. Then maybe a few years after that, you have some very small, fast-growing trees. Maybe 20, 30 years after that, you may have bigger trees. So this process over time, that's called succession.
Are trees weeds?
Now, the first, this can even happen starting with bare rock. So you can have just a complete bare rock and eventually end up with an ecosystem there.
Wait, what's there?
What are the first, just rock.
Like
So what are like the first things that that could grow on just rock?
moss.
Moss.
Sometimes.
Lichens are tiny little scaly stuff that you might see if you go hiking and there's rock.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's lichen. Those things could start to grow, but as they grow and eventually die, what starts to build up on that rock? A tiny, very, very thin layer of soil. And that very thin layer of soil allows for some very tiny plants to start to grow. As they grow and die and decompose, what happens to the soil? It gets thicker until it can support slightly bigger plants. And if you repeat this over, hundreds and hundreds of years, you eventually can have a full ecosystem in that area. Those very first species that begin to grow, we call pioneer species. And again, another social studies lesson. Who were the pioneers of America? What did they pioneers do? They moved westward, expanding into new territory. Pioneer organisms are the very first species that can establish themselves in an ecosystem. Jackson?
Oh, I just forgot. I never mind about it.
Now, Joe?
I heard that a guy had a glass bottle and he enclosed it and he left it for a long, 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 long and when he came back, it was like a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, you kind of have an ecosystem in glass enclosure if you have the right combination of plants and animals. All right, now eventually, like we're talking about, you said after the forest fire 100 years later, it probably looks like a forest again. That final stage that an ecosystem reaches through succession is called the climax community. The climax community is sort of the last stage that's stable. And in our area, the climax community, what the climax community is going to be will depend on the climate. So in our area, if you took, let's say in your backyard, if you never mowed it again, and you went back in 100 years, what would your backyard be?
Like forest.
Yeah, probably forest. Our climax community in this climate is generally called a temperate deciduous forest. A forest of beech trees, maple trees, birch trees. That's sort of like our typical climax community in this area. If you go a little bit north, or if you go higher up in the mountains, it might be like a spruce forest. But it depends on the climate. Now, other areas, it's not forest. Like if you went to the Midwest, if you went to Iowa, probably the climax community is more of a grassland or prairie. That's the climax community. If you go to the Southwest, the climax community may be desert ecosystem. So it sort of just depends on what the climate is, what the climax community of that climate is. Yep.
When I went to South Dakota, it was all flat, but when I went to Salt Lake City, it was all desert.
Yeah, and same sort of land, but in different climates, you end up with different climax communities. Jackson?
Is that why, like, when there's over here, like where the patio is, like the hot place, there used to be like this giant mountain of dirt, and now it's like covered in grass.
Yeah, because that's like the beginnings of succession. Yes, exactly. Now, like I said, it's not always a forest. We sort of might think about it that way because that's our climate, but in other areas, there's lots of different types of ecosystems it could be. So I just have here a few pictures that show, this again would be that succession with the various species growing up over time. This is sort of our area. You might have, lichens and moss as the pioneers, and then small grasses, bigger herbs, shrubs, seedlings, quick growing trees, slower growing trees. That's as time goes on. And actually, this even happens in ponds. If you have like a pond that's not fed constantly by a spring or by a stream, oftentimes what happens to these ponds is as plants in there and animals and stuff grow, as they break down, as they die and decompose, what happens to the depth of the pond? It gets shallower. This sediment builds up on the bottom and continues to build up until eventually it can be completely filled in and start to become a terrestrial, a land ecosystem. If you know anybody has lives out in the country and they might have a pond on their property, they may have to dredge it every 5 or 10 years, which means basically use a machine to suck out all that sediment so that it stays as a pond and doesn't continue to fill in. All right, so that's the end of our ecology section. The next portion of this unit is about environmental issues. And that's related to ecology, obviously, because human impacts affect various ecosystems. So that's what we'll talk about as our last section. So humans have lots of various effects on the environment, on the earth, mostly in a negative way, mostly damaging ecosystems. And the reason for that, the reason that humans are a species like any other, but humans can do quite a bit of damage to natural ecosystems. And you can think about that as 2 reasons. First is we can alter our environment more than any other species. Obviously. Lots of animals and plants and stuff alter their environment. A beaver, for example, does a lot of altering of its environment by cutting down trees, building a dam, transforming a stream into a pond. That's pretty big impact. But humans can basically make any ecosystem into what we want. We build huge cities in the middle of the desert where really you shouldn't have big cities. We do that by irrigation, by air conditioning. So we can modify the environment. And that's one of the reasons why we can do so much damage. We're not restricted to living in one certain area that meets our needs. We can go wherever we want and alter the environment. The other thing is population growth. There are a lot of humans on the earth. How many?
Bajillions.
11 million.
No?
2 billion. 7 billion.
7. 7 billion people about on the earth. That's a lot. Oh, let me go back to that. And having that many people is a problem because all of those people require certain things. Food, obviously, water, living space, homes. But not only do they require those things, they also want a lot of other things, like cars, air conditioning, phones, all sorts of things. And all of those things also require resources. Okay? The more people you have, the more resources that they're going to need from the earth. There's a term in ecology called carrying capacity. Maybe the carrying capacity of the courtyard ecosystem for squirrels is 4. Because the ecosystem out there might be able to support about 4 squirrels. What if 10 squirrels go in there?
There's not going to be enough space.
Not enough, not so much space, because they can fit, not enough resources, and therefore, they're not going to be able to get enough, whatever, food or water, and what happens to the population? They're going to die off because not enough resources to support that. Well, the Earth has a carrying capacity as well for humans. Okay? There can't be an unlimited number of people living on the Earth that could expect to have proper food and water and so forth. And so if we start to reach that level where we're taxing the Earth's ability to provide for those people, well, then you have problems. Then you have, maybe it's water that becomes a limiting resource, clean water to drink, or food to drink. And then you have things like famine, or wars over those resources, things like that. So we need to manage resources as effectively as we can, and that's some of what we'll talk about. This is a graph showing the population of the Earth over a long period of time. And if you look at it, you see obviously, starts off, the population of the Earth for a long, long time was under 100 million people living on Earth for thousands of years. You see a little dip here because of the plague. But then you see, once we start to reach modern times, okay, you see that this graph just, we call that exponential growth. It just skyrockets. Now, so the population was just this for so long. Does anybody have any idea about what the reason that this graph skyrocketed like that? Christian? Patrick?
Like jobs.
Not so much jobs, Juliana.
Technology.
You're getting there, certain technology, something specific.
More effective medicine.
Yes, that's the big thing. More effective medicine. So until 200 years ago, maybe, there were not even really real doctors. There was no real medicines other than traditional plants and stuff people would use. So medicine is the big one. In fact, there's the two most important, I would say, medical advances that allowed this to happen are one thing that helps you recover from getting sick and one thing that prevents you from getting sick. You're on the right track. What?
Vaccinations.
Yes. One is vaccinations. So humans discovered that you can vaccinate people against getting certain illnesses. There are diseases which today in the United States almost nobody gets. Polio, measles, although it's on the rise. Smallpox has been eradicated. And these are diseases that used to cripple and kill thousands and thousands of people. But now we have vaccines. that prevent us from getting these diseases. So that allowed people to survive longer, live longer, and that leads to a higher population. There's one other important thing. So that's preventing illness. What's the key thing about recovering from illness? Let's say an example. In the Civil War, if the soldier was shot in the arm
Amputation.
with a relatively minor wound, they didn't bleed out, they didn't die from bleeding to death, they didn't have damage to any major organs, but often they would still die from that injury. Why? Sarah?
Hospitalization.
Well, it's along that time.
Sanitation.
Well, sanitary conditions and what?
Infection.
Infection of bacteria. What do we have today that would prevent that soldier from dying?
It's like cleaning stuff.
Well, that's part of it. But also, how about in terms of medication? If you get an infection, what kind of medication you get?
Oh, you get like those pad things.
Oh, like one thing.
No? Antibiotics.
Ah.
Antibiotics were only discovered relatively recently. So, during the Civil War, a minor infection would spread into a person's body and eventually kill them. Today, they would be just minor injuries. That person would be given antibiotics, stitched up, and would be fine. So antibiotics allowed us to survive many of these infections that in the past we couldn't. Things